Welcome to the Covered Bridges in New Hampshire podcast, where we discuss all things related to covered bridges in the Granite State. Here's your host, Kim Chandler.
Hello, Covered Bridge people, and welcome to the podcast. Today we're speaking with George Bourne, Historic Resources Specialist with the New Hampshire Land and Community Heritage Investment Program. George explains how LCHIP supports the protection of significant historic and cultural sites across the state, including several of New Hampshire's covered bridges. Here we go. In this episode, we'll learn about the New Hampshire Land and Community Heritage Investment Program, or LCHIP. Created in 2000, LCHIP is an independent state authority that awards matching grants to New Hampshire communities and nonprofits to conserve and preserve New Hampshire's most important natural, cultural, and historic resources, and to ensure the perpetual contribution of these resources to the economy, environment, and quality of life in New Hampshire. LCHIP funds have been allocated to preserve several of New Hampshire's historic covered bridges. Today we're speaking with LCHIP Historic Resources Specialist George Bourne. George grew up in the seacoast area of New Hampshire and southern Maine, where early exposure to the area's rich historical and architectural legacy nurtured an interest in preservation. He received a bachelor's degree in art from Brown University, a master's in historic preservation from the University of Vermont, and a PhD in American and New England Studies from Boston University. He has worked at the Smithsonian, the Historic Florida Keys Foundation, and the Providence, Rhode Island Preservation Society. He also taught courses in American architecture and historic preservation at Bridgewater State University. Additionally, he has served on preservation commissions in Key West and Somerville, Massachusetts, and written articles and books on local history and preservation. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Could you provide for our listeners a brief overview of LCHIP and what its mission is?
So LCHIP is a statewide grant program. It's run by an independent state authority to provide grant funds for the preservation and conservation of New Hampshire's most significant natural, historic, and cultural resources.
How is LCHIP governed?
Well, it's governed by a board of directors.
Okay.
There are 18 members of our board. 4 of them are legislative members, 2 senators and 2 representatives. We have 8 members of the sort of general public, you could say, that are appointed. And then there are 6 agency heads, commissioners and directors of various state departments and divisions and things that have non-voting seats on the board.
Okay. And I'm assuming that you're state funded?
We are state funded, yes,
Okay.
indeed, entirely so, from a couple different pots of money. The main amount of money that we use for giving grants comes from the various $25 recording fees that are collected around the state at the various registries of deeds. Every time a property is sold, mortgages recorded or discharged, or a set of plans are recorded. And those $25, one at a time throughout the course of the year adds up bit by bit to, $3.5 million a year to give away in grant funds.
That's excellent.
So,
I didn't know that.
yeah. And then the smaller pot of money is the Moose Plate Grant Program,
Okay.
the New Hampshire Conservation License Plate Program, which collects money and disperses it for a variety of worthy enterprises, and we get some allocation from that to help defray our administrative expenses.
Excellent. I love the Moose Plate program. Those funds show up in a lot of different places.
They
especially with
do.
covered
If you're
bridges.
driving down the highway and you see wildflowers growing by the side of it, there's a good chance they were planted with Moose Plate funds. There's natural resource grants and other historic grants also directly
Yeah,
from this Division of Natural and Historic Cultural Resources.
that's excellent. And what types of grants do you offer specifically?
Yeah, well, in the main, our grants sort of fall into 2 categories: natural resource grants that are focused on conserving important natural resources, land conservation projects, um, and that can be to help organizations purchase land for preservation or to purchase easement interests in land, which allow the main title to be held privately, but the land to be preserved forever. And then the other side of it is historic preservation grants, which of course is where covered bridges fall into things.
Mm-hmm.
And preservation grants mostly are rehabilitation grants or restoration grants. To actually do work, swing hammers and drive nails, onto historic buildings and
Right.
structures. But we also do offer a few smaller amounts of preservation grants too to help planning um, and the creation of historic structure reports and the kinds of documents and research that's helpful to actually
Mhm.
later do a full rehabilitation project.
Right. I notice now that aware of LCHIP, I notice in a lot of old buildings as I'm traveling around the state giving programs, as I'll see a small LCHIP plaque that, this building was restored using funding from LCHIP. So it seems
Yes,
like
they're
they're
starting to
everywhere.
pile up. We've so we've been doing this for 25 years. We're celebrating 25 years of grant making this summer. Um, Founded in 2000, but the first grants went out in 2001. So 2026 is kind of an anniversary year, and we do give out those bronze plaques to commemorate structures and buildings and things that have benefited from such grants.
Yeah. Do you know how many grants LCHIP has awarded in the last 25 years and what that
So
total
the
is?
last, the in the 2025 annual report, which is the last full year for which we have figures available, it was 615 grants,
Wow.
and that includes natural and preservation grants.
That's a lot.
Yeah, yeah, I think in a fairly small amount of time, we can all wrap our minds around 25 years, and
Yeah.
that's dozens of grants a year, obviously.
Right. That's excellent. And covered bridges, as I know and have received funding through the historic preservation side of the grants. And how does a project qualify for an historic preservation grant?
Well, a couple major hurdles that projects have to get past. So, first of all, the resource itself to qualify for a historic preservation grant needs to be considered historic. And by our definition of historic, that means that the resource is either listed or determined eligible for listing on either the state or the National Register of Historic Places.
Okay. So they don't have to be listed. They just need to be
They don't
eligible
have
to
to be
be
listed,
listed.
it's determined out, but the determination of eligibility is still a formal process. It stops just short of the listing, and so it's meant to be based on scholarship and real knowledge about the history of whatever it is that's being
Okay.
considered. Um,
And do you know how is a resource eligible for state or the national
well,
registry?
so anybody who's managing or owns a historic, what they think could be a historic resource structure, can go to the State Division of Historical Resources and inquire about the process and the possibility of getting listed or getting at least a determination of eligibility. That includes private homeowners or anything like that. Anybody
Mm-hmm.
who's curious about their structure. I mean, they're basically several criterion, and you only have to meet one of them. So the first one is having to do with historical events or broad patterns of history. The second criterion has to do with association with persons who've made an impact in history. The third is architectural or engineering significance. And the fourth is the capacity of a resource um, to provide information in the future if further research is done. That's usually reserved for archaeological
Okay.
sites on the
Okay.
presumption that further archaeological study could bear out more information.
Right.
So, and most of the resources we deal with are eligible on the first and the third criterion. So, broad historic significance and/or architectural, structural, engineering significance.
Okay. And I've noticed that most of the New Hampshire's covered bridges are on the national registry, not all, but quite a few, and fewer on the state registry. So I'm assuming this is kind of off topic a little bit, but it's up to those communities to apply for the registry. So it really
Yes,
so whether a property is on it is really just dependent upon whether that community wanted to apply.
exactly. And from an LCHIP point of view, it doesn't matter whether it's state or national register or actually listed or determined eligible for listing.
Mhm.
But you're right; it very much depends on the initiative and interest of somebody to start the process.
Right.
Mm. The
Yeah.
other thing I wanted to point out was besides having an eligible resource, a historic resource, is that we need to have an eligible entity. The owner or the applicant to LCHIP has to be eligible. And that falls into one of two categories. The first is a political subdivision of the state of New Hampshire, which is a municipality, a city or a town or a school district or a county or something like that. And the second is a publicly supported nonprofit organization that's recognized as exempt from federal taxes under Section 501(c) of the Internal Revenue Code. So those are the kinds of organizations that we can actually award a grant to.
Okay.
So if
So
we have an
I
eligible
couldn't
resource and an eligible entity, we can start a conversation.
okay. So if I owned a covered bridge, which there's one for sale right now for $1.25 million, I might add, which I don't have, unfortunately. But if I owned a covered bridge, I would not be eligible for a grant because I'm a private person.
Right, exactly. So the bridge could
Okay.
be eligible because it's on the national or state register or eligible to be so. But yeah, without an eligible entity or property owner, that would not be the
Got
case.
it.
I would encourage you, if there's a bridge for sale, I would encourage either an existing political subdivision of the state or a 501(c) nonprofit organization to take it on and take it over and
Yeah.
and make it so make it would be not just LCHIP, it would be more eligible for more grants from other
Right.
sources too.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would like to own it, but that will not be happening in this lifetime. And and so I know projects have to adhere to the Secretary for the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, which is a mouthful. And
It
that
is.
was something I had never, as a before I started this research, I didn't know what that was. And it's exceedingly valuable. Can you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
what
So the
that means?
Secretary of Standards for the treatment of historic properties are kind of the the baseline best practices for re- rehabilitating, repairing, and restoring historic buildings and structures. In the United States, it's kind of become our national standard. They were developed by the National Park Service,
Mhm.
who obviously have the knowledge and know how to provide that kind of assistance in developing those kinds of standards. But they really became used in the 1970s and 80s when there were tax credits available for income producing properties that were historic. And in order to award those tax credits, there needed to be a publicly um, published standard
Mhm.
for preservation and rehabilitation. So there's actually, interestingly, the National Park Service not too long ago, within the last decade, developed a separate or specialized, specially crafted set of Secretary of the Interior standards for covered bridges.
Mhm.
And that was prompted by a conference at the University of Vermont in Burlington, Vermont, some years ago.
Mhm.
And the National Park Service rose to the challenge and created sort of a specialized set of guidelines for doing work on historic bridges, which are a little bit different from your average building because of the
Right.
engineering and the structure and the exposure to the elements and all that kind of thing.
Right. And so I'm assuming that if you award a grant, then is it up to you someone in your organization is monitoring to make sure that the work is done in line with
That
those?
that someone would be either me or the other historic resource specialist in this office. Um, so we typically award grants, and then there's a series of further documentation that's required once the grant is awarded before the work it begins.
Okay.
And often that's when a recipient will go out to might create bid documents. They go out to bid, they collect estimates and review them, and start formulating a real project budget based on real numbers, not just
Mhm.
projections,
Right.
for several years into the future. Um, So yes, that's part of our review once projects are funded.
Yeah, and, which is kinda leans into my next question, and I think I know the answer to this, but how would somebody apply for an LCHIP grant, and what's that timeline, and what's that process? Like, I'm assuming it takes a good amount of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to be thinking about things maybe a few years in advance because,
Mhm,
for example, if you don't know whether or not your building or structure is listed or eligible for listing on the state or national register, that's something to figure out. And if it
mhm,
isn't, do it. Get that process going. That's a process that happens with the State Division of Historical Resources, not with LCHIP.
mhm.
So it's something that needs to be finished by the time you come to the LCHIP's door looking for money.
Right.
Um, and then the other thing that's a good thing to get going on, ahead of time is a preservation plan, which can be a historic structure report or historic building assessment with preservation guidelines or what have you. But these are documents that are commissioned and usually by hiring a team of consultants who are experts in their respective domains to study whatever it is that's proposed for rehabilitation work, to research its history, to take an assessment of current conditions, and then to figure out for the future what are the recommended tasks that need to
Mhm,
happen. So that can take a little time to figure out, what you want to do, who you want to hire. Um, there are usually site visits, drafts that are circulated, and so forth. But it's a very helpful process
mhm,
because uh, these projects can get very expensive. They can have lots of forks in the road that you can't otherwise predict, especially when you start, pulling off sheathing and what roofing materials, and you see more things that are wrong than you initially thought. So, as much
right.
planning as can happen in advance helps can help to reduce problems later on. So,
Mhm,
and those kinds of studies are required for LCHIP projects with the total project cost of more than $50,000. Um,
okay,
so it's good to get that thing in the works.
right. And kinda now I'm kinda ready to dive in a little bit to some of the LCHIP funded covered bridge projects, and I think that the Sillyville Bog Bridge and the Columbia Bridges received their awards in your first grant round in 2001. And in the case of the Columbia Bridge, I know that the total project cost was $70,000 or so, which was funded by a combination of monies from town funds, state bridge aid, a Connecticut River Partnership grant, and LCHIP funds. So how is the amount? How do you how do you decide how much LCHIP will give to a project?
Right. So part of it depends on what people ask for.
Okay.
And that's why getting back to the preservation planning process, one of the first tasks of a prospective applicant to LGIP is to figure out, first of all, how much might this whole project cost? That's the first part. And then the second part is how much should we ask from LGIP?
Mhm.
So LGIP can't pay for more than 50% of total project cost.
Okay.
So all of LGIP's grants are matching grants. So that does require, additional fundraising and managing uh, grants, plus sometimes grants from multiple sources and the timeframes and requirements of that, which can be challenging.
Mhm.
Um, when LCHIP receives a grant application, one of the things that everybody looks at, the review panels and the board members look at is, is this a realistic estimate of what the cost is, and is LCHIP's share um, appropriate? Um, and each grant round is a little different. That said, some grant rounds are more competitive than others. So it's hard to say, with any definitive sense that a grant of X number of dollars will absolutely never ever work
Mhm.
when a grant of Y always would work, because
Right.
it depends who else is in the mix in a given grant round, how much money is available.
Okay.
Um,
And you mentioned earlier that, and I know this happens with covered bridges especially, is they'll have everything ready to go, and then they go and open up the bridge, and they find that there's a lot more work needed than they thought.
mhm.
Do your grants can they fluctuate if the costs go up, or is it this is the set grant? It doesn't matter what you find once you open
So,
up the guts of the bridge.
well, the thing is that LCHIP grants are made on an annual basis. So,
Okay.
when we make an award, we put that money, metaphorically, aside,
Mhm.
so that it's there when it's needed. And really, the only way to get more money is to come back
Okay.
in a subsequent grant round.
Okay.
Um,
So they would have
you
I
know,
mean, they would just have to find the overruns from a different
yeah,
source. Yeah.
and that's again, another reason why good project estimating is really
It's key.
helpful and
Yeah.
important to do.
Yeah.
And it's an awkward position to be in too for a recipient to say, "Oh yeah, I know we were here a couple of years ago, but and thanks for the grant, but we actually need more."
Right.
uh, because they already had their chance to make the case, and now they're coming back, and else has changed.
Right.
It's not an advantageous position to be in. So
Right. Exactly.
it's helpful to again do that planning and to ask for the right amount for as
Right.
right
Ahead
amount
of
as you
time.
can.
Do you ever have people give money back? Like they asked for a certain amount of money and they didn't use it all?
It
Probably
does
not.
happen.
It
It's not a
does.
majority of times, but it does happen, and sometimes we had an initial so when the pandemic occurred, we had a a lot of people interested in the grants because buildings were closed anyway. It was a good time to work on them.
Right.
And so we had a big influx of grants at that time. We also had, because of all the real estate transactions and all those city people that decided to move to New Hampshire to their summer house or whatever and live year round and do their work and buy new places.
Mhm.
The recording fees from the registries of deeds were up for a few years too, so we had more money to give out. So those were good years for that. Um, I lost my train of thought. What was your question
If
specifically?
people ever give money back.
Yeah, if they give back. So the estimates that were given out at that time during that time frame tended to be very robust. I mean, contractors were really hard to find. They were
Uh-huh.
redoing everybody's kitchens and building additions
Right.
onto their houses for remote offices and things like that.
Mhm.
And so, the estimates were very high. And I think, what happened after the pandemic, after the boom died down, is that prices became a little more reasonable, and
Mhm.
so some people came in under budget. um, we also do allow up to a 10% contingency to be added to rehabilitation costs during the application
Okay.
phase. So some people add a 10% contingency on the hard costs and then they wind up not needing it.
Right.
And so if the grant was made at a full 50% of the total project cost that included a 10% contingency, then that final payment gets adjusted downward to
Right.
paying more than 50%.
Excellent. Interesting. And so my next question is about the Sillyville Bog Bridge, which is also again in really bad shape. So you may, I don't know, you might hear from the town. I'm not sure, but so that bridge was closed in 1997, and the fundraising was very challenging for the town. And the work was finally done in 2003. And when they began the fundraising, their estimate was $150,000. And of course, that bridge doesn't carry vehicle traffic, so it didn't qualify for the state bridge aid program. So LCHIP did supplement that project in 2001, and they finally received their federal grant, which doesn't exist anymore. But they received a federal grant in 2003. Is it typical for a project to take? I mean, this was 6, 7 years. Is that
That is
typical
not
or
typical.
it's not? Okay.
No, it's not typical. And um, the expectation normally is that a project should be done in a couple of years.
Okay.
Typically, project agreements are for 2 years. Extensions are possible, but um, the hope is that if work isn't completely shovel ready when the grant is awarded, that it will be ready um, fairly soon. There may be certain occasions, doesn't happen a lot, but sometimes, in fundraising circles, there's discussion about who should be the first one in, and sometimes if a grant can be awarded, that can help with private fundraising events and so forth. Um,
Right.
but no, it was never the intention with that grant to to spread out as long as it
Right.
did.
And you mentioned matching grants, and I was just it clicked in my head. I wonder if some of these projects apply for a grant through you and then apply for a grant through another organization, and each is waiting on the other to approve it so it can be matched. I wonder how that first of all, grant writing gives me a headache. If someone asks me to write a grant, I'm like, "Oh, see ya, I can't do it." Because it's a
Yeah.
lot of work, and
Yeah,
so
and the federal grants are particularly difficult and
yeah.
onerous, and federal I don't think federal grants can match federal grants, so
Okay.
there's, there are sometimes limitations on what can match what. It's not uncommon, though, for us to see, particularly in a grant proposal, where people are sort of trying to figure out where all this money is gonna come from that they need,
Mhm.
where they'll list a bunch of different grants and, with certain there might be some grants that have been awarded, but not paid. There might be some grants where they've just sent it in and they expect to hear during our review period, and there may be other sources of funding where they put in a line and they won't know until after our grant
Yeah.
decision period is over. So, um, in that initial phase, sometimes people will list extra funding on the principle that they may not get it all,
Right.
and which is wise.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. It's such a process. Um,
Mhm. It
and I think
is.
about, some communities who are able to fund covered bridge work just through their taxes. That's always amazing to me too, because that sometimes the voters don't, especially in small towns where we have town meeting. Sometimes they'll argue for 6 hours about whether the town should buy a fire truck, but a lot of times with the covered bridges, they just pass it. So, which is lucky, I think, for some communities.
I mean, covered bridges are so iconic in New Hampshire, and there aren't nearly as many as there used to be, so they are kind of a, limited resource, and,
Mhm.
so it certainly depends on the community, but if you're driving up Route 16 and you happen to go by Jackson, you're gonna see that red covered bridge there.
Right.
No, that's like you're in Jackson. It's almost synonymous with the
Yeah.
town if you're driving by it like that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of other communities realize that.
Yeah, I think so too. So another another terribly long project, this one was actually, I think, one of the longest covered bridge projects in the state was the Whittier Bridge in Ossipee, and they started fundraising in 2005, and by 2007, they were still really short, and they ended up on the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance's 7 to Save list, and then the following year, they were awarded a $100,000 LCHIP grant. It d do those does being on the 7 to Save list help secure grant funding? Are they connected at all?
Then they're not connected literally. I mean, we don't, give extra points or anything like that just because something's on the Seven to Save list.
Okay.
But I think the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance's Seven to Save list is meant to highlight resources that
Mhm.
are significant historically, that have um, the backing of a core group of dedicated people who will champion the cause,
Mhm.
and that have a chance of succeeding. And those are things
Yeah.
that we look at too. I mean, we look at the resource significance at LCHIP.
Mhm.
We look at the capacity of the team to manage a grant, to run a rehabilitation project, to provide good stewardship. Um, so, and we look for we want projects obviously to be successful too. So, yeah, I don't think there's not a direct correlation, but sometimes yes, there are resources that measure up to both sets of both the Preservation Alliance's criteria for seventh
Right.
save as well as ours for awarding grants.
Right. And that project, so it started in 2005. The federal funding came in 2008. I think they did phase 1 where they moved the bridge off the river, and it sat there for 6 years until it was fixed in 2014, and then it sat there again until it was put back across the river in 2021, and I think you're gonna tell me, but is that's not typical for a project to take
Well, so in
all
that
that
case,
time.
the LCHIP project actually ended in 2016 on that project. So
Okay.
LCHIP was involved in the safe removal of the bridge from its somewhat apparently not good condition, in its original position on the river,
Right.
over the river. There was some delay apparently about whether they were going to go through what's called the design bid build process or the
Mhm.
design build process, and
Right.
that's a kind of a technical way about how projects are managed and so forth.
Mhm.
Um, and DOT was involved in that and had to sign off on it. So there were multiple reviews.
Mhm.
The Division of Historical Resources was also involved. Um, but the LCHIP project wrapped up after the repairs to the wooden part of the bridge were made.
Okay.
Um, at the end of 2015, I think the project wrapped up in 2016 from our point of view.
Mhm.
And then, yes, it did sit for a while, and then they got additional funding to fix the abutments
Right.
and to be able to move the structure back over the river
Right.
some years later. So at
And
that point, the bridge was under an agreement with LCHIP. The project was concluded, but there was a term stewardship agreement with LCHIP. So we were involved a little bit in just reviewing that second phase of work and making sure that it complied
okay.
with preservation standards and so forth. Um, but we were not funders for that latter part of the
Okay.
project.
And I think you answered this already, but could they have come back and asked for a second grant to put it
Yes,
back?
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
they could have come back. I think they had. I don't think they were. They had. I think identified other funding sources to do that
I think they did, yeah.
piece of it. Um, but yeah, people can and sometimes do come back.
Excellent. And the last bridge that I'm aware of that has received LCHIP funding is the historic Pier Railroad Bridge in Newport, built in 1907. And it's the longest surviving covered railroad bridge in the world. And it had pretty extensive repairs in the late 2000s, which were funded by a variety of different sources. But that was a project that actually ran out of money and has not been finished. So, is that typical for projects to peter out with the funding?
Well, that's no, I don't think it's typical. Of course,
Okay.
I'm not in a neutral position here. I'm I work with people to complete projects.
Right.
In the case of that LCHIP project, the scope of work was very limited. From our point of view on that
Okay.
project, I was focused on installation of a fire detection system and the wiring that was associated with that. I think they added fire suppression
Mhm.
and some things like that to help protect the building from getting burned and vandalized or whatever and ruined.
Right.
Um, but that, of course, left the actual major work to elsewhere. I think that was a
Okay.
$40,000 grant. It was not a big grant
Okay.
from as LCHIP grants go, which can go up to $500,000.
Right.
It was
So that grant was
a small
just
piece
for
of the whole.
the fire system, not
It said other repairs, but it that seemed to be minor in comparison to the fire risk
okay.
component of the scope of work.
Okay. And that's another example of a a beautiful historic structure, but it doesn't carry traffic. It doesn't it's not part of our,
It's a bike
DOT
trail, isn't
system
it?
either. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it
Yeah,
is. So it
yeah,
doesn't
good.
really qualify for a lot of funding, you know.
Mm.
Interesting. Well, thank you for putting the fire suppression system in there. That's important. Very
It
important.
is important. It
Yeah.
truly is.
Yep.
Yep.
Fire is still the number one cause of loss of covered bridges,
I
believe it or
totally
not.
believe that. Totally believe that. I've s seen church steeples struck by lightning while I've been here, and,
Mm,
all of our lovely wooden historic structures all over the state are very much prone
right.
to burning, unfortunately.
So I do know that there are several covered bridges in the state that are in need of funding. I mentioned Sillyville Bog earlier. There's a historic box pony covered bridge in Wilton that they're just starting the process of looking for funding. So how can folks find out more about LCHIP and how can they contact you?
Yeah, well, the place to start, of course, in our age is the internet. So
Right.
our website is www.lchip.org, and we've got lots of information there for prospective applicants. And you can always, give us a call. Where our office is in downtown Concord, and you could even come by if you want to. Happy to meet with people too.
Excellent. Well, thank you for LCHIP for supporting work on our historic covered bridges. Your involvement has been critical in ensuring that these bridges stand today, and I'm sure it won't be the last. I'm sure there'll be more LCHIP plaques on the covered bridges as we
Well,
move
it's
the
very
future.
gratifying to be involved in this program and to see the good work that the program has done over the last quarter of a century, and look forward to some more good projects.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me today.
You're very welcome. It was really a pleasure.
The Covered Bridges of New Hampshire podcast is created and hosted by me and recorded in Hancock, New Hampshire. The song Old New Hampshire was arranged and performed by Josh Black. Our introduction is courtesy of Greg Kretschmar. This podcast is a companion to my book, Covered Bridges of New Hampshire. You can learn more about the book, explore blog posts, view covered bridge videos and photographs, check event listings, and access an interactive covered bridge map at coveredbridgesnh.com. Follow Covered Bridges of New Hampshire on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube for additional content and updates. If you enjoy the podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Kim Chandler. Thank you for listening.